By looking at World War II, we may understand how many Russians were killed to bring Hitler to his knees and defeat the Nazis. The people killed on the Russian side are not even comparable by any means to the U.S. casualties. On February 1990, James Baker, then Secretary of State to George H.W. Bush, asked Gorbachev to accept the reunification of Germany and promises that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. And George H.W. Bush says, "We will not take advantage, and all we want is a Europe whole and free and at peace." You may want to know what went wrong almost 77 years after World War II. We are now dealing with a serious conflict between the U.S. and Russia that may lead us to World War III. Noam Chomsky, in an interview on April 17, 2015, gives his take on the U.S.-Russian relations after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He explains how the U.S. broke its promise to Gorbachev and how NATO started to expand.
This goes back to 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a question as to what would happen with NATO. Gorbachev agreed to allow Germany to be unified and to join NATO. It's a pretty remarkable concession, with a quid pro quo that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. That was the phrase that was used.
So Russia has been provoked?
Well, what happened? NATO instantly moved to East Germany. Then Clinton came along, expanded NATO right to the borders of Russia. Now there are the new Ukrainian government, the government after the overthrow of the preceding one. The parliament voted, I think 300 to 8 or something like that, to move to join NATO.
Which you can understand why they would want to join NATO. You can see why Petro Poroshenko's government would probably see that it's protecting his country.
No, it's not protect. Crimea was taken away after the overthrow of the government, right? He's not protecting Ukraine, is threatening Ukraine with major war. That's not protection. The point is, this is a serious strategic threat to Russia, which any Russian leader would have to react to. That's well understood.
Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. did everything to interfere in Russia's internal affairs. Scott Ritter explains that the U.S. wants to manage Russia, even by hurting Russians.
You know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, something happened. Because during the times of the Soviet Union, we treated the Soviets as equals. They were our peers. Mm-hmm. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia stopped being an equal, and we started treating Russia like a defeated nation, like a defeated people. They were our lessers now. They were no longer equals. We treated them as lessers. And something happens in the mindset of people who are preparing to deal with this. First thing is they started shutting down the old Russian area studies programs, shutting them down. And the new programs that emerged weren't so much about learning about the soul and the character and the linguistics it was learning how to exploit Russia. They were literally courses on how to bring democracy to Russia, how to bring capitalism to Russia, how to save Russia from being Russia. That's the wrong mindset. I mean, that might be a good mindset if your focus is, the economic exploitation of Russia. Maybe that's how you want to train yourself. But you will never know the Russian people by behaving that way. You will never know the Russian character, the Russian soul. You will have no insights into how they think, what they believe, how they feel. All you'll be doing is exploiting them. And in doing so, engendering them, I think, I'm not going to say hatred, but engendering some hard feelings on the part of Russians towards what you're doing. And I think that's where we are today. We have a nation that stopped studying Russia, and we now have replaced it with a nation that seeks to manage Russia, as if Russia is our problem to manage. We managed Russia during the Yeltsin period poorly, but we did. I mean, people talk about stolen elections. The 1996 election in Russia was 100% stolen by the United States. We brag about it. Time magazine front page cover proclaiming how we bought the election. And then we've been resentful since late 1999, early 2000, when Vladimir Putin became president, we've been resentful of his, of his desire to make Russia a great nation again. There's nothing wrong with Russia being a great nation. It is a great nation. Doesn't mean it's the greatest nation. Doesn't mean it's better than America. Russians may believe so, but I mean, Americans, we don't have to sit there and say, oh, Russia is everything. No, Russia is Russia. That's the important thing. Russia is Russia. Nothing more, nothing less. But you need to respect that. You need to understand that, and you need to deal with that. And we don't. We continue to this day to try and manage Russia. We try to impose democracy on Russia, but it's not democracy. Democracy has grown from within. I mean, we should study our own history. The American democracy came from America. Nobody brought democracy over here and said, here, let me teach you how to be. We had to learn it. Every successful democratic nation learned how to be democratic on their own terms. What we've done is we have corrupted the principles of democracy because we're seeking to impose our vision, which is derived from American history, American culture, American imperatives, and we're trying to impose that on Russia, ignoring their history, ignoring their culture, ignoring their imperatives, and it fails. And when it fails, we say, see, they're undemocratic. That's not true. Russia is a democracy. It's not a Jeffersonian democracy. Could Russia improve as a democracy? Maybe. That's up to Russia. We don't get to say. We don't have a vote. It's none of our business. But I will tell you this, if we left Russia alone and let Russia sort out Russia's problems on its own, I have a funny feeling, based upon what I know of the Russian people, they'd do a pretty good job of it. They'd come up with something that worked. But we keep interfering. And in doing so, we keep cutting the legs out from underneath them. We're doing that economically now. I mean, how can you possibly say that you support the Russian people while imposing the most stringent economic sanctions imaginable on them? Sanctions that are designed to hurt the Russian people. Plain and simple.
Jeffrey Sachs believes that the Ukraine war could have been avoided by simply Biden accepting to negotiate with Putin and considering his serious concerns.
What we hear from the rhetoric in our mainstream media in the United States is, well, Putin is a Hitler, and he has to be stopped, and we have to defeat him. And it's as simple as that. And there's no talking to him. The man is crazed, living in a dream world of Russian imperialism. There's no stopping him. Any agreement is to rip up a piece of paper. I can tell you, since I'm an old guy now, 67, I've lived through this characterization. Every decade, there's a new Hitler that we can't deal with, whether it was Ho Chi Minh or whether it was Vietnam or whether it was Cambodia or Laos or Nicaragua, for heaven's sake, or Iraq or Syria. We are real good at this game of rhetoric, but this is not real. And since I am all over the world, virtually all the time, speaking with world leaders, what we hear in our media is propaganda. It is not real. We should be negotiating. Actually, Biden refused to negotiate with Putin in 2021 because Putin raised a very specific set of points. One was NATO enlargement. And then there's a chorus here that says, oh, that's a phony issue. That's a red herring. That's fake. That's not fake. I've been in this issue since 1990, when the West promised Gorbachev no NATO enlargement. We're liars. I'm sorry to put it that way. We cheated. We continue to do this. And then Biden refused to negotiate. Okay, that's straightforward, except it's not the way the story is told. Then there is the question of Ukraine itself, which is an ethnically divided country because there is a significant Russian minority. And those are real issues, by the way, although war is not an answer to them in any sense. But there was a very complicated, very difficult conflict where the U.S. was stirring the pot also back in a decade ago, and especially around 2014 and 2015. And there were actually agreements reached for the area where the fighting is raging right now, for the Donbass region. And the agreements were called the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. They were signed by the Ukraine government. And then the government said, no, we don't want to do those. And when Putin says, well, what about the Minsk agreements? He is shouted down or ignored. Oh, they don't exist. They were unfair. They were this, they were that. They were actually agreements. When I say this, I can only tell you how many emails I'm going to get from Ukrainian Canadians, Ukrainian Americans. Sachs, are you crazy? What are you saying? But the truth is, diplomacy is crucial if you're going to avoid wars. Signing agreements matters. You can't just walk away from them. That's true of Russia, I'm the first to say. It's true of Ukraine also. It's true of the United States also. And so we actually should be sitting down and negotiating. And all of our media don't discuss substance of what this war is really about, or what its roots are, or even what the claims of Putin are. Just say repeatedly, he's Hitler, he's a madman, he's out of control, there's nothing to do but defeat him. That's our mantra. That kind of mantra can get us all killed if we go down this road, because it's false and it's extraordinarily dangerous. Because, like it or not, we don't like it, but Russia has 1,600 active nuclear warheads, and we don't even want to sit down to talk. And shame on our government not to have diplomacy with Russia. At least sit, talk, discuss, and explain. We don't do that. We just say victory, victory, victory on the battlefield. Well, I'm not in it for that, because this is a very dangerous and very unwise approach.
So why was Biden not willing to negotiate? John Mearsheimer gives two reasons for the U.S. choosing to confront Russia instead of negotiating.
It's very important to understand that the United States did not have a confrontational policy toward Russia until February 22nd, 2014, when the Ukraine crisis broke out. One might think that the first tranche of NATO expansion in 1999, second tranche of NATO expansion in 2004 were aimed at containing an aggressive Russia. Nothing could be further from the truth. We did not view Russia as a threat until 2014. There's no question that we were contemptuous of Russia's security concerns, right? The United States didn't pay much attention to Russian complaints about NATO expansion, withdrawal from the ABM treaty, and so forth and so on. But we did not have a confrontational policy until the Ukraine crisis broke out in 2014. At that point, we did a 180-degree turn. That went a long way towards poisoning relations. The second thing that happened was the 2016 election. The Democrats lost. Hillary Clinton in particular lost. And the Democrats decided, by and large, to blame Russian interference for her loss. They did not want to admit that it was because Hillary was a terrible candidate or Trump was an attractive candidate to a large chunk of Americans. So they blamed the Russians. This really inflamed large numbers of Americans in terms of their view towards Russia. And then the third thing that I think matters here is Putin's views on gays and his unwillingness to sort of go along with the social agenda that large chunks, if not almost all, of the American elite believes in. It makes him look like an antediluvian figure. The end result of all this is that we have a Russophobia before the Ukraine crisis this December 2021. We have a Russophobia problem in this country that is really unprecedented. Then the Ukraine crisis breaks out and you get a war.
So how we got into this mess? In 2014, a series of events led to the takeover of Crimea by Russians. John Mearsheimer explains how these events were developed to result in the Ukraine war.
So the question of who caused it and who bears the blame really matters. Now, the conventional wisdom in the United States and in the West more generally is that the Russians are responsible for this. And in particular, Vladimir Putin is responsible. As I'm sure almost all of you know, I don't buy this argument at all, and I haven't bought it for a long time. In my opinion, the West bears primary responsibility for what is happening today. And it was largely a result of a decision in April 2006 to make Ukraine and to make Georgia a part of NATO. We were going to integrate Ukraine into NATO come hell or high water. Now, the Russians said at the time that this is categorically unacceptable. The Russians made it clear that they had swallowed the first two tranches of NATO expansion, the 99 expansion and the 2004 expansion, but Georgia and Ukraine were not going to become part of NATO. They were drawing a line in the sand. They said this is an existential threat to us. And indeed, in August of that year, of course, August 2008, you had a war involving the Russians and the Georgians over the whole issue of whether or not Georgia would become part of NATO. Now, it's important to understand that when we talk about Western policy and we focus on NATO and expansion of NATO into Ukraine, that actually Western policy had three prongs to it. The core prong was definitely integrating Ukraine into NATO. But the other two prongs were integrating Ukraine into the European Union and turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. In effect, putting in place the Orange Revolution. And these three prongs of the strategy were all designed to make Ukraine a pro-Western country, a country in the West orbit sitting on Russia's border. And again, the Russians made it unequivocally clear at the time that this was not going to happen. Now, the first crisis broke out in February 2014. The way I like to think about this is that you had a major crisis in February 2014, broke out that date. Then you had a major crisis breaking out in December of last year, that's December 2021, and on February 24th of this year, the war started. Now, what about this crisis in February of 2014, February 22nd to be exact? It was precipitated in large part by a coup that was supported by the United States that took place in Ukraine and resulted in a pro-Russian leader, President Yanukovych, being overthrown and being replaced by a pro-American prime minister. The Russians found this intolerable. At the same time, they were debating with the West and with the Ukrainians over EU expansion. And always in the background at that point in time was NATO expansion. This blew up, and it had two consequences. One is that the Russians, in effect, took Crimea away from Ukraine for themselves. They had no intention of ever letting Sevastopol become a NATO. And the second thing that happened is that the Russians helped foster a civil war in eastern Ukraine. And of course, that civil war festered well after 2014. But the crisis really blew up in 2014. Then, starting about mid-year, and really heating up at the end of last year, I would say in December 2021, was a second major crisis. And the question is, what caused this crisis? And in my opinion, it was caused largely by the fact that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. It's commonplace in the West, especially in Washington these days, to say that Russia had nothing to fear regarding Ukraine becoming part of NATO. And Russia had nothing to fear because NATO was doing nothing to move forward Ukraine's incorporation into NATO. I think in a de jure sense, that's absolutely correct. But in a de facto way, that's wrong. What we were doing was we were arming the Ukrainians. And you want to remember, it's President Trump in December of 2017, who was under great pressure, who decided to arm the Ukrainians. So we were arming the Ukrainians, we were training the Ukrainians, and we were forming ever closer diplomatic ties with the Ukrainians. And this spooked the Russians. It especially spooked the Russians in the summer of last year when the Ukrainian military used drones against Russian forces in the Donbass region. It especially spooked the Russians last summer when the British drove a destroyer through territorial waters, Russian territorial waters in the Black Sea. It especially spooked the Russians in November when we were flying bombers within 13 miles of the Russian coast. So all these events, coupled with this de facto bringing of Ukraine into NATO, pushed the Russians to what Sergei Lavrov said was the boiling point. You know, Lavrov was asked in January why the Russians had reached this point and why we were in the midst of a crisis. And he said, Lavrov said in January, we had reached our boiling point. First expansion of NATO, second expansion of NATO, and then all of these events associated with Ukraine. The Russians had had it. So you had a crisis of massive proportions, which of course resulted on February 24th in the Russians invading Ukraine. And we are now in the midst of a real war. This is not just a civil war in eastern Ukraine, which is what we had before February 24th. We now have a real war. So this brings us to the question of what is the conventional wisdom on this subject, and how do I think about the opposing argument? The opposing argument is that this has nothing to do with NATO expansion. It's really quite remarkable. When you listen to people in the administration speak, and when you read editorials in the Washington Post, words like this are spoken. This has absolutely nothing to do with NATO expansion. I don't know how anybody can say that. The Russians have been saying since April 2008 that this is all about NATO expansion, that NATO expansion into Ukraine is an existential threat to them. But Americans simply refuse to believe that. Not all Americans, but many Americans, and certainly the policy elite in this country.
A clip came out showing the conversation between Victoria Nuland and the U.S. ambassador discussing the coup in 2014.
What do you think?
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think what in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay, good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting, and that Yats was going to offer in that context a three-way, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah,
okay.
I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it. And again, the fact that this is out there right now, I'm still trying to figure out in my mind why Yanukovych did that. But in the meantime, there's a Party of Regions faction meeting going on right now, and I'm sure there's a lively argument going on in that group at this point. But anyway, we could land jelly side up on this one if we move fast. So let me work on Klitschko, and if you can just keep, I think we want to try to get somebody with an international personality to come out here and help to midwife this thing. And then the other issue is some kind of outreach to Yanukovych, but we probably regroup on that tomorrow as we see how things start to fall into place.
So on that piece, Jeff, when I wrote the note, Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So okay. Biden's willing.
Okay.
Ray McGovern traces the events accurately and explains how it turned into the Ukraine war.
This coup was the most blatant coup in history. It was advertised 18 days beforehand on YouTube. When a conversation, an intercepted conversation between Assistant Secretary of State Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt was put on YouTube on the 4th of February, 2014. Now, McGovern, being used to a little bit used to coups and what happens if they're divulged ahead of time, breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Oh, poor Yatsenyuk. He's never going to be prime minister now that the coup's blown." Well, apparently, Vladimir Putin had the same reaction because he stayed in Sochi for the Winter Olympics, never decided to come home. And lo and behold, on the 22nd of February, there's the coup. Now, we know enough about the coup now to know that it was arranged with thanks to the Western intelligence services, if you could put it that way. And we know the result. Now, for just a little bit of background, why did Victoria Nuland, whose claim to fame is working for Dick Cheney and who is an arch neocon person, why did she decide it was so important to get the Russians, to get them over the barrel in Ukraine? Well, it goes back to the year before. The year before, when if we could have the second slide, when I say slide, the year before, when President Obama, to his credit, was reluctant to start another war in the Middle East. They wanted him to bomb Syria. He didn't want to bomb Syria. He even said, you know, I'll go to Congress. So that's a big deal, okay? Now, here was a New York Times op-ed after Putin pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire. I hope that you can see it. It appeared on September 11th, 2014. In the midst of all this, this appeared in the New York Times, and it said that my working and personal relationship with Obama is marked by growing trust. Trust, the coin of the realm. Then he objected to something. Then he said, you know, his speech, that Obama's speech last week really bothered me. I don't agree with it at all. This business about the exceptional country being able to do exceptional things. No. The way I look at it, there are big countries and small countries, rich and poor, one with long traditions of democracy, others different, their policies different. Well, we're all different. But when the Lord's blessings look on us, we must not forget that God created us all equal. Now, I was told at the time by a pretty good source that Putin penned that last paragraph of that op-ed himself. And confirmation of a kind came about 2 years ago when he gave an interview, and sort of off the top of his head, he said precisely the same thing in almost exactly the same words. So what does that mean? Growing trust? What does that do to the Mickey Mouse? What does that do to the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex, which grew like topsy after Eisenhower's warning that unbridled influence of this MIC, the military-industrial complex, would be a danger to our democracy. A little footnote there. Eisenhower said the only antidote to that is a fully informed American citizenry. And we have that far from that now. What's my point here? This was the high water of our relationship, September 2013. It took the neocons not even a year, about a half a year, to stage the coup on the Maidan in Kiev. The causal relationship was not something that McGovern dreamed up. Bob Perry and I went through this in detail, and it seemed, and actually I had a catbird seat at the top of the CNN building when Joe Lieberman and Paul Wolfowitz were talking about this as though, well, it looked like a funeral there. They had missed their chance. They didn't get their war against Syria. And so a lot of this was reaction to that. They had a lot of time to prepare, and they invested $5 billion with a B, dollars into Ukraine's aspirations to join the West, okay? So here we had a decent chance for growing trust, okay? Doveraj, no proveraj. Trust, but verify. This was all shunted aside by the coup, arranged primarily by Nuland and Pyatt and the other people who were doing the dirty work, and acquiesced in by our French and our German allies. They were there. They saw what happened. Steinmeier, the German foreign minister, I met with his principal deputy, and I started talking about the coup in Kiev, and he said, get this. He said, what coup? He was there. Steinmeier and the French took it upon themselves to guarantee the Minsk process, and they didn't have the chance. They didn't have the guts to follow through because the US didn't want it. So maybe I'm an offensive realist, but that's how I look at it. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, now, just at about this time, you will you'd be surprised, perhaps. No, no, it's the one before that. Yeah. Now, the Defense Intelligence Agency is obliged by act of Congress to make sure they do an annual strategy report. And this is what they came up with at the end of 2015. So they had a year plus since the coup. Now, that's what they said. That's what the Kremlin is convinced the US is trying to do. John Mearsheimer is very nice in calling that democracy promotion. but he explains that in the next phrase by saying it's a coup. So this is what the Defense Intelligence Agency said. Who knows that they issued this? Did McGovern get this from Jonathan Pollard or one of his old successors? No. You have to read everything that comes out in the media. This slipped out. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, what I'd like to do is get a little granular here and talk about how we proceeded once Biden got his feet, so to speak, feet on the ground. I call this U.S. diplomacy. You can think of it what you will. March 17th, Putin's a killer. March 18th, 19th, Blinken and Sullivan insult the Chinese, talking down to them and making very much like the old imperialists that the Chinese are so used to. Now, interestingly, on March 24th, this is all last year, the Ukrainian President Zelensky, out of the blue, announced, we're taking back Crimea. We're taking back Crimea, and if we have to use military means, well, so be it. That's what we'll do. And, I don't think there's anybody, not even on CNN, who would say that Zelensky thought up this idea all by himself and didn't check with the United States. Of course, he got permission. So put yourself in Putin's place. It's pretty much a declaration of war and was described as such by Western media as well. Aha, what's Putin going to do now? It's Ukrainian official policy. It's an order that we're going to take back Crimea. This is important, okay? Because it's all in this calculation that Putin is looking at these new leaders, if you will, and seeing what they're doing, how they're acting, killer, talking down the Chinese. Now we're going to take back Crimea. Now, on March 25th, no coincidence, 24th, 25th, Russian troops start going around the area of Ukraine. Now, they built up a lot of troops. And of course, we reported that, and the New York Times, Washington Post reported that ad nauseum. But finally, Biden got wind of it, or at least started to appreciate the significance of it. And he calls Putin on April 13th. Now, what else happened on April 13th? Well, everybody was saying, oh, there are tons of troops there. There are a lot of troops. And Shoigu, the defense minister, gets up and says, yeah, you got that right. Would you believe 2 armies and 3 airborne units? Would you believe that? That's what we mean by disequilibrium. This is what we mean by asymmetrical power. You got it? Biden, on that same day, reverses the Navy's orders, sending 2 heavily armed and very sophisticated ships into the Black Sea. They were about to enter the Dardanelles, and he turned them around and said, go visit Greece. And then finally, on that same day, Biden suggests, hey, Vladimir, let's have a summit. We'd like to get together and talk this stuff through because we don't like this, okay? Next slide, please. So the summit takes place on the 16th of June, okay? And Biden says to Putin, and we know this from Biden's own voice, okay? What Biden is saying on his they couldn't get him onto the plane long enough to have him say these strange things, okay? Biden to Putin, we know you got a rough road to hoe here. We know you're being squeezed by the Chinese. We know their multi-thousand-mile border. Chinese is not only going to be a major economic power, it's going to be a major military. We know about that. You know, I would love to have been a fly on the wall when Putin connected with his advisors and said, who's advising this president? Who's telling him that the situation is the same between China and Russia as it was 4 decades ago? I mean, hello? And so they decided, Putin and Xi finally, we got to educate this guy. We got to tell him that nobody's squeezing anyone else except in a fraternal embrace. And that's what they set out to do for the next several months. On December 15th, 2021, there was a summit, a virtual summit between Putin and Xi, President Xi Jinping of China. Now, it was heavily choreographed, and they gave the first minute to the New York Times and other media because it was so clearly designed to show, look, we are very close allies. As a matter of fact, they made the claim that our relationship, our strategic relationship, exceeds an alliance in its closeness and in its effectiveness. Now, most people say, well, that's really, really neat rhetoric. Chinese don't usually do that rhetoric, but it's, you know, it helps Putin. Well, that's what it was designed to do, okay? Now, on December 15th, when they said this, on that very same day, the Russians gave those draft treaties, those very far-reaching proposals, they still call them, on the security situation in Europe and how it has to change, okay? Now, I suppose it could be a coincidence that the Russians picked that same day, showing the closeness of their relationship with China and giving this ultimatum in some sense to the West and to the US. I don't think it was a coincidence. Maybe we have the next slide, please. Okay, now we fast forward to this year, February 4th, Putin is in Beijing to launch the Olympics with Xi. And he says that, you know, our friendship, well, actually, they both say in a very, very important joint declaration, not just rhetoric, guys, this is the real thing. Friendship between its two states has no limits. There are no, quote, forbidden areas of cooperation. Whoa, well, are we to take them at their word? When do the Winter Olympics end? When are they over? People were saying that the Russians might strike out against Ukraine, but would pause until the Olympics were over. When did the Russians invade Ukraine? You know, after a couple of days after the end of the Olympics. May we have the next slide, please? Okay, now the big deal here is what a surprise this was to all of us, right? I mean, it wasn't all of us, it was me and lots of others. And I next Saturday, I thought I'd go to confession of being so wrong, but the line was so long with my colleagues that I thought I'd put it off till the next Saturday. Yeah, dead wrong on whether the Russians would invade Ukraine. I didn't think they needed to. I thought they could get what they wanted simply by acquiescing in the notion that they couldn't get NATO to say, no more people in NATO, not going to happen anyway, and then going for what they call the secondary issues, like the employment of cruise missiles and worse right at the western edge of Russia. But no, it ends up here that China has supported Putin. I think, not only a lot of Russian experts, but a lot of Chinese experts were surprised at that. I mean, rhetoric is one thing. Violating your cardinal foreign policy principle of non-intervention in the affairs of other people, as was China's, is another thing. And it's been a whole week now. We don't know. Maybe the Chinese will change their mind, but so far, and not only China, India. Now, I asked myself the question, well, what's different between the West and the US and India and China? Well, I mean, one obvious difference is they were all white and they're non-white. And that could be very mischievous because James Baldwin, way back when, suggested that it's much easier for imperialist whites to get out after blacks or browns or yellows. So, does exceeds an alliance mean mutual defense pact? Well, probably not. I don't think the Chinese want to be bound by what happens in Europe. And I don't think the Russians want to be bound by what some crazy Chinaman might do vis-a-vis Taiwan. But it's a virtual alliance. And it's no small thing that China is supporting Putin on the ground at the UN and elsewhere. And it's more than rhetoric. Now, when we talk about Putin's new, I called it assertiveness, and I've been saying for weeks now that China is the much neglected factor behind this. China has made Putin a big guy, like on the streets of New York. Nobody's going to push me around anymore because I got the leader of this other gang that's really, really powerful. So you're going to push me around anymore. I think that's a big part of why Putin has proven not only assertive, but aggressive. And I wonder where he'll stop. I just don't know. The real question here is how we can work to make sure that negotiations succeed once Putin has finished what he intends to do in Ukraine. And that's a biggie. That's really big because right now we're looking pretty silly by imploring the Chinese, look, do something about this fella, do something. Can't you intercede? And we're looking a little bit strange because, as I say, not only China, but other countries, including India, have voted against us. Now, do we have let's see how much time we have. Yeah, for one more minute, I want to show another video. And I think it's important to know this because it's way back a while ago, I think 15, and it shows Putin talking about what really, really troubles him. And it was the notion that tomahawk, as Putin says, missiles can be placed in these so-called ABM sites in Poland, Romania, and maybe even Ukraine. Would it be possible to show the 2.5 minutes of that right now? This is from an old recording. Very, very good attention to this next clip, which just is about a minute long. And it shows Putin very uncharacteristically losing his cool. He's talking to Western journalists. They don't get it, okay? They have no idea how the Russians look at this as a threat to their national security, as a threat to the retaliatory capability if these missile defense systems are able to squelch their offensive capability with their ICBM. So watch this next thing, and you'll see from this segment, which I hope will go on just a few seconds now, how Putin really is kind of beside himself because as you can see, some of these Western journalists say, "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah." So let's have that second clip, please.
Угрозы нет, а система ПРО продолжает строиться. Значит, мы были правы, когда говорили, что нас обманывают. С нами неискренне, ссылаясь на якобы имеющуюся иранскую ядерную угрозу при строительстве системы ПРО. Ну так оно и есть на самом деле. В очередной раз пытались нас надуть. Сейчас построили эту систему, сейчас ставят там ракеты. Так? Но вам должно быть известно, что ракеты эти закладываются в капсулу, которая используется для пусков ракет средней дальности «Томагавк» морского базирования. Туда закладывают сейчас антиракеты, способные поражать цели на расстоянии 500 километров. Но мы знаем, технологии развиваются. Мы примерно знаем, в каком году примерно американцы получат новую ракету, которая будет уже не 500 километров, а 1000, а потом больше. И с этого момента они начнут угрожать нашему ядерному потенциалу. Мы по годам знаем, что будет происходить. И они знают, что мы знаем. Это вам только вешают лапшу на уши, как у нас говорят, а вы, в свою очередь, вешаете своему населению. И люди не чувствуют опасности. Вот меня что беспокоит. Ну как мы не можем понять? Мы тащим мир вообще в совершенно новое измерение. Вот в чем проблема. Делают вид, что как будто ничего не происходит. Но я не знаю даже, как достучаться.
So there you have it. What's the matter with you folks? Why can't you understand this? And he's talking to the journalists, of course, and you can't see any rational discussion of this in Western media.
So just to finish up here, here's Putin way back then saying, how am I going to get through to you? And it was the same in his official conversations with US statesmen, okay? And that's when he and the military in Russia built up these hypersonic missiles. And he said, look, now you have to listen to me. And that's when he went after China to become a virtual ally. Now, I thought, as I wrote, that Putin making these far-reaching proposals would be satisfied with half a loaf. This loaf seemed really important to him. The notion that tomahawks and worse could be stationed right across the border. But no, he wasn't satisfied, obviously. What he wanted to do, and this I underestimated, was to make sure that he protected Russian-speaking and Russian citizens in Ukraine. And he's done that and still more. So where will he stop? I think he stops when he's satisfied that there are no more Nazis or proto-Nazis or neo-Nazis in power there. That's going to take some cleansing, but he's going to do it. And then I hope, and I expect that the Chinese and the Russians get together. Okay, that's enough of that stuff. Now let's get together and make sure nothing untoward happens in the future.
Colonel Douglas Macgregor explains how hard Putin tried to avoid this war, but no one in the West was listening to him.
Putin, from where he sits, looks at what's going on. He's aware of the things that we're discussing, but he also saw a large troop buildup in eastern Ukraine, approximately 60,000 troops that were poised to strike at the Donbass, at Luhansk and Donetsk. And I think he was persuaded that this would happen and that obviously the Donetsk and Luhansk republics and their population would be destroyed. And he could not sit by and tolerate that. I also think he thought that there was no hope, that every time he tried to make the case, which he did several times, no one would listen to him. Somebody said, well, the reason this didn't happen under Donald Trump was that Donald Trump is strong and no one would challenge him. It had a lot less to do with that than Trump's private willingness to listen to Mr. Putin's position. What disappointed Putin, and I think many others, was Donald Trump's inability to get control of his own administration. He appointed people that were absolutely opposed to him and his thinking. So from the moment he opened his mouth and said, why can't we have a better relationship with Russia, he was sabotaged and subverted. Putin realized that. Then I think he waited to see how Biden would respond. And of course, you know that Biden was bragging about how he told Putin that he was a vicious killer and a thug, how proud he was of insulting the man to his face and denigrating him and what he's done inside Russia. I think you put that together with the buildup in the East, and I think he felt Russia was genuinely threatened, and he thought it was only a matter of time until something akin to the Pershing II missiles that we once had on the ground in Germany would show up in eastern Ukraine. And we can all sit here and say, oh, well, that wouldn't have happened. But he had a lot of reason to believe that it would, for the reasons we've already discussed, the NATOization of things. And that's the kind that, remember, the Pershing II was a hypersonic missile. You know, you're talking a few minutes and it lands in Moscow. And he kept telling people this. No one would listen. And there was no willingness to reassure him and his government in any way, shape, or form that this was not the intention. So I think he rightly concluded he didn't have much choice. And I think the biggest mistake that he's made, if he's made any with this operation, so I think he's tried to be too careful. And I think it's tragic. But when you do what he's done with his force, you try very hard to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties and avoid damage, you end up in the position he's in.
He also believes it was in the U.S. interest to avoid this war, but both Republican and Democratic parties were screaming for blood. He describes that the NATO expansion is aimed at the regime change in Russia.
Well, the only real business we have, frankly, is in finding a way to avoid the kind of conflict that we're now in. We have a permanent interest in essentially preventing war from breaking out on the European continent. In fact, after 1991-92, NATO really existed in the minds of most of its members to prevent another war in Europe. So from that standpoint, I think we had an interest in that. Obviously, we've done the opposite. We seem to have done everything in our power to bring on conflict, which is tragic. And I had hoped that there would be an interest now in finding some sort of way to arrange a ceasefire and then hammer out details of a larger agreement. But I don't see any evidence for that at all. In fact, I see evidence for the opposite. If you look at the members of both parties, the so-called uniparty, everyone is screaming for blood. And it's not difficult to discern their real interest, which is in regime change in Moscow, which I think is lunacy. And it's also an unattainable objective. This collection of people that we now refer to as globalist elites, people who are interested in open borders, denationalizing Europe, denationalizing the United States, they're in control again. They really never gave up control completely after George W. Bush was elected. Effectively, the same people came in and continued the policies that had emerged in the late 1990s. So remember that when we became involved in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bosnia-Herzegovina rapidly became about dislodging Milosevic and his government from power. Initially, they were seen as a legacy of communism, not without some judgment that was accurate, but they misjudged the larger picture. It had less to do with communism, more to do with nationalism. So they saw him as a leader they had to remove, and the Kosovo Air Campaign presented itself as yet another opportunity. And the opportunity unfolded in ways that people didn't understand. They grossly underestimated the Serbs, their staying power, but ultimately they managed to persuade Yeltsin in Moscow to abandon the Serbs. And that sent a whole range of new forces into action that offended the Russians, angered the Russians. The Russians began saying that, who's next on the menu? And, you know the stories about Iraq and Afghanistan. Everything was about toppling the government and then installing something new that was theoretically democratic for the purpose of advancing this so-called globalist agenda, which herded everyone into some global version of the European Union and increasingly a global version of NATO, all designed to extend the power and the influence of the United States. And over the last several years, I would go back certainly to the early part of this century, we began conducting exercises in the Baltic with U.S. naval and air power and even ground forces only 50 nautical miles from St. Petersburg. This has been going on for some time. We began conducting exercises right on the border of Poland and Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, in close proximity to Russia. So the Russians have been watching this for some time. That's one of the reasons they seized Crimea, was because they didn't want it to become a NATO naval base. And they were confident, based on our behavior, that was inevitable if they didn't do something to stop it. I think they thought that that would warn us off. Now we have a government that has taken the position until quite recently that the Russians would never act. They would never dare to attack Ukraine, even though it was patently obvious to those of us that have been watching this business since about 2007, that was inevitable. For instance, the current CIA director, when he was ambassador in Moscow, wrote a memorandum talking about the Russians actually mean what they're saying. There is a red line, and we'd better not cross it. And his point was at the time, Burns, that we were crossing it, that we were going to make some sort of military action in Ukraine inevitable by our behavior. Well, we've done that. We don't bother to talk about it because that doesn't fit the current narrative, that the unprovoked attack by the evil Putin is the source of all the problems in Europe and Ukraine. But, you know, there's a narrative that has been built that is widely embraced by the mainstream media, that's been carefully fabricated, designed to justify essentially whatever we want to do. But they were wrong. The Russians went in when they said they would not. They are wrong now if they believe that we can continue to push over the border into Ukraine, not just military equipment and military assistance, but also U.S. military personnel in any way or NATO personnel in any way without provoking an all-out war with Russia. They seem to think Russia is Iraq. That's their theory. They don't understand Russia is not Iraq.